Welcome to another deep dive. Um, Today we're going exploring something that I find equal parts fascinating and disturbing. The techniques of mental coercion. How can minds be influenced, even broken? We'll be looking at this through the lens of history and psychology, using excerpts from the book The Rape of the Mind by Joost A. and Meerloo, specifically chapters 1 through 4. Get ready for some seriously unsettling stories, but also some profound insights into what makes individuals vulnerable and what defenses they might have.
What's intriguing is how Meerloo doesn't just theorize about this. He brings it to life with shocking real-world cases.
Huh?
We'll unpack those, but what I think you'll find even more gripping are the core psychological mechanisms behind them.
Okay, so tease us a little. What kind of cases are we talking about?
Well, we'll delve into the story of Colonel Frank H. Schwibel, an American officer who confessed to war crimes he didn't commit during the Korean War. It's a chilling example of how psychological pressure and isolation can lead to false confessions. We'll also examine the Reichstag fire trial and the Moscow purge trials, which Meerloo uses to illustrate his concept of menticide, the systematic killing of the mind for political gain.
Menticide, what a powerful, unsettling word. So let's start with Colonel Schwibel. I know a bit about the Korean War, but this is a case I hadn't heard of before.
It's a story that really underscores the fragility of human autonomy under duress. Colonel Schwibel was captured during the war and subjected to months of psychological manipulation by his Chinese captors. They used sleep deprivation, humiliation, and relentless interrogation, not to extract information, but to force him to confess to something he didn't do, that the U.S. was using germ warfare in Korea.
It sounds like something out of a movie, almost too horrible to believe.
And yet, it happened. Eventually, under immense pressure, Colonel Schwibel caved. He signed a detailed confession, naming names, describing missions, even though he knew it was all a lie. He later said of his confession, "The words were mine, but the thoughts were theirs," perfectly capturing the essence of mental coercion. What's striking is that he felt it, believed it, even while knowing it was false. This really emphasizes how effective these techniques can be in producing false confessions.
It's a stark reminder that even individuals we might consider strong, like a seasoned military officer, can be broken down under the right pressure. It makes you wonder, how do we even begin to define the right pressure?
Well, Meerloo argues that it's not just about the intensity of the pressure, but also about the specific techniques used and the individual's psychological vulnerabilities. In Colonel Schwibel's case, the prolonged isolation, the relentless questioning, the constant undermining of his sense of self, all of these factors contributed to his eventual breakdown.
So it's a combination of external pressures and internal vulnerabilities that create the conditions for this kind of mental coercion. It's not just about being physically strong or having a strong will. This makes me think about those social experiments where people conform to group pressure, even when they know it's wrong, only on a much more intense scale.
Exactly. Meerloo's work helps us understand that we're all susceptible to social influence, and that certain situations can amplify that susceptibility.
Let's move on to another example Meerloo highlights. The 1933 Reichstag fire trial. Wasn't that a pivotal moment for the Nazis?
Absolutely. This was a key event that allowed the Nazis to consolidate their power. A mentally unstable individual, Marinus van der Loop, was coerced into confessing to setting the fire, a confession the Nazis then used to crack down on opposition and justify their increasingly totalitarian control.
So in this case, it wasn't about extracting a false confession from someone who was innocent. It was about exploiting a vulnerable individual to achieve a political goal.
Precisely. This is a classic example of menticide in action. It wasn't just about punishing an individual. It was about using that individual to control the narrative, to create a climate of fear, and to eliminate dissent.
It's disturbing how readily people accepted the official narrative, even though there were doubts about the confession's validity.
This speaks to the power of propaganda and the way that information control can shape public perception. The Nazis were masters at manipulating the media and controlling the flow of information, creating an environment where their version of events became the accepted truth.
This makes me think of how easily misinformation spreads on social media today. Even though we have access to so much information, it can still be difficult to discern truth from falsehood when we're constantly bombarded with conflicting narratives.
That's a great point. Meerloo's work highlights the importance of critical thinking, of being able to evaluate information sources and to question the narratives we're presented with, even those that seem authoritative.
So menticide isn't just a historical phenomenon, it's something we need to be vigilant against, even in our seemingly free and open societies.
Absolutely. The techniques of mental coercion can be applied in subtle ways, even in everday life. Understanding those techniques is crucial for recognizing and resisting them.
Let's dive into another historical example. The Moscow Purge trials in the 1930s. These were incredibly disturbing events.
Indeed. The Moscow Purge trials involved show trials of dedicated Bolsheviks who suddenly confessed to all sorts of fabricated crimes. These confessions were likely the result of intense psychological pressure and torture, and they often led to imprisonment and even execution.
These trials weren't just about eliminating political rivals. They were about creating a climate of fear and paranoia, where anyone could be accused of disloyalty. This must have been incredibly effective in consolidating Stalin's power.
Absolutely. The confessions, regardless of their veracity, served as powerful propaganda, convincing many people that there were indeed enemies within the party who needed to be purged. This shows how mental coercion can be used not just to control individuals, but to manipulate entire societies.
These historical examples are so unsettling because they highlight how fragile our mental autonomy can be. Even individuals we might consider strong, like Colonel Schwiebel or the dedicated Bolsheviks, can be broken down under the right conditions.
It's a sobering thought. Meerloo's work is a call to recognize our vulnerabilities and to be vigilant against any attempt to undermine our freedom of thought.
And these examples are just the tip of the iceberg. Meerloo goes on to explore the specific techniques used by the Nazis during their reign of terror, drawing on his personal experiences during the occupation of the Netherlands. Let's move on to that now.
Yes, let's delve into that next. Meerloo's first-hand accounts provide chilling insights into the psychological tactics employed by the Gestapo.
So we've been unpacking some pretty heavy historical examples of menticide. But what makes Meerloo's work so compelling is that it's not just an academic exercise for him. He experienced the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands firsthand, even working with the Dutch resistance.
Meerloo wasn't just observing these tactics from afar. He was living through them, and as a psychiatrist, he had this unique vantage point to understand the mental and emotional toll they took on people.
I imagine that witnessing these events up close must have been both terrifying and incredibly insightful for him. What were some of the key things he learned from his time in the resistance?
One of the most striking things for Meerloo was the realization that it wasn't just physical torture the Gestapo relied on. They were masters of psychological manipulation, preying on people's deepest fears and insecurities.
So it wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about breaking people's spirits, making them doubt themselves, their loyalties, even their own sanity.
Exactly. They would isolate people, deprive them of sleep, bombard them with contradictory information, all designed to create a state of confusion and vulnerability. They knew that a mind in turmoil is much easier to control.
And Meerloo was actually trying to find ways to help resistance fighters withstand these tactics, right? He even conducted some pretty risky experiments to figure out how to prepare people mentally for interrogation and torture.
That's right. He explored everything from relaxation techniques to the potential use of drugs, anything that might bolster someone's mental resilience in the face of unimaginable pressure. What he discovered, though, is that there's no easy answer, no magic bullet. For example, some drugs that dulled physical pain actually ended up making people more susceptible to psychological manipulation.
Wow, talk about a double-edged sword. So what were some of the key takeaways from all this for Meerloo? What did he learn about how people react under these extreme conditions?
One of his most important observations was just how widespread this vulnerability to mental breakdown under duress really is. He saw firsthand that even the most resolute, committed individuals could be broken down under the right conditions. This experience really solidified his understanding of menticide and the techniques used to achieve it.
It's a stark reminder that none of us are immune to these kinds of pressures. It makes you wonder how you would react in a similar situation, how much you could withstand before you'd break.
It's a question that haunts us all, isn't it? But it's also a question that Meerloo felt was vital to address. He believed that understanding these techniques, recognizing the signs of mental manipulation, was crucial for resisting them.
Eventually, Meerloo had to flee the Netherlands when the Nazis discovered his work with the resistance. It's remarkable he managed to escape and continue his work.
He eventually made his way to London, where he continued to work with victims of Nazi terror, helping them to heal and rebuild their lives. Later, he had the opportunity to observe the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazis' systematic use of coercive methods was laid bare for the world to see.
I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to witness those trials, to see the perpetrators of these horrors brought to justice.
It was undoubtedly a profound experience, a chance for him to confront the evil he had witnessed, and to see accountability being sought, but it also solidified his understanding of the scope and depth of the Nazis' psychological warfare.
This is all incredibly insightful, but I have to ask, how does this connect back to Pavlov and his dogs? We're talking about human beings, not animals being trained to salivate at the sound of a bell.
That's where things get even more disturbing. Meerloo saw a direct connection between Pavlov's classical conditioning experiments and the methods used by totalitarian regimes to achieve mass submission. He argued that regimes like the Soviet Union were essentially using Pavlovian techniques on their own citizens.
So they were taking those principles of conditioned reflexes,
Yeah,
the bell, the food, the salivation, and applying them on a societal scale. That's a pretty unsettling thought.
it is. And they did this through propaganda, information control, and strategic use of rewards and punishments.
Can you break down how this worked in practice? I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around how you could apply animal training techniques to an entire population.
Think about the core elements of Pavlovian conditioning: repetition, control of information, and rewards and punishments. These can be applied on a mass scale to manipulate people's thoughts and behavior.
Give me an example. How did this actually play out?
Take the Soviet Union under Stalin, for instance. They bombarded people with relentless propaganda, the same messages over and over again, using state-controlled media to create this echo chamber where alternative viewpoints were silenced. They severely limited access to outside information.
So it was about controlling the narrative, creating a reality where their ideology was the only truth. It's like creating a mental cage for people where they're only exposed to the information that reinforces the regime's power.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They created elaborate systems of rewards and punishments to enforce desired behaviors. Conformity brought social status and economic benefits, while any form of dissent was met with swift and brutal punishment.
So it wasn't just about shaping beliefs, it was about controlling actions. If you didn't comply, there were real consequences.
Precisely. But it's important to remember that this wasn't just about brute force. They were also exploiting deeper psychological needs, like our inherent desire to belong, our fear of isolation and rejection. By creating a climate of fear and suspicion, they were able to manipulate people into conforming, even if they had doubts or reservations.
It's chilling how they were able to create this atmosphere where people were afraid to even think dissenting thoughts.
And it's not just about historical regimes. Meerloo argued that these techniques are still relevant today, and that we need to be aware of how they can be used to manipulate us in more subtle ways.
This makes me think of how targeted advertising works, how algorithms can be used to feed us information that reinforces our existing biases and keeps us in these echo chambers. It's like a personalized form of propaganda.
You're exactly right. Meerloo's work is a call to be more aware of the information we consume and the sources we trust. It's about cultivating critical thinking skills and being wary of any attempt to manipulate our thoughts and beliefs.
Meerloo also talked about how the Chinese government used Pavlovian tactics on American prisoners of war during the Korean War, right? I remember you mentioning this earlier.
Yes, that's another chilling example. The Chinese understood that breaking down resistance wasn't always about physical force. They used boredom, hunger, and endless repetition to wear down the American POWs, making them more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? How did they actually use those things as tools of coercion? It sounds almost counterintuitive.
They would subject the POWs to these incredibly long political lectures, often in Chinese, knowing full well most prisoners couldn't understand a word. The goal wasn't to educate them about communist ideology. It was to create a sense of helplessness, to erode their sense of agency, to make them feel like resistance was futile.
It's like they were trying to break their spirits, make them feel like they had no control over their own minds or their own destinies.
Exactly. And that's the insidious nature of these techniques. They can be subtle, almost invisible, but they can have a devastating impact on a person's sense of self and their ability to resist manipulation.
So what Meerloo is saying is that menticide can take many forms, from the overt brutality of torture to the more insidious techniques of psychological manipulation. And it can be applied in any context, not just in totalitarian regimes.
Yes, that's the key takeaway here. Menticide is a danger we need to be aware of, not just in extreme situations,
Right.
but in our everyday lives.
We've covered some really heavy territory so far, from historical examples of menticide to the chilling ways Pavlovian conditioning can be used to control people. But Meerloo doesn't stop there. He also delves into the use of drugs and hypnosis as tools of coercion.
These are areas where the ethical implications of these techniques become really apparent. Take drugs, for example. The allure of escaping reality or experiencing heightened pleasure is powerful. But as Meerloo points out, that allure can be a trapdoor leading to addiction and a weakening of mental fortitude.
It makes you think about how widespread drug and alcohol use is in our society. Are we all just walking around primed for manipulation because of it?
That might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a question worth pondering. The more we rely on substances to alter our moods or escape reality, the more vulnerable we become to those who might want to exploit that dependence. And this exploitation doesn't have to be as blatant as what we've seen in totalitarian regimes.
So it's not just about governments or captors using drugs to control people. It's about recognizing how even seemingly harmless substances can lower our inhibitions and make us more susceptible to suggestion or manipulation in our everyday lives.
Exactly. It's about understanding the subtle ways in which our choices can impact our vulnerability.
Meerloo seems particularly concerned about hypnosis. What are his thoughts on how it can be misused?
He sees hypnosis as a form of intensified suggestion, a way to bypass our conscious defenses and potentially access a person's innermost thoughts and even compel actions. He raises serious ethical concerns about its use, especially in legal contexts.
He even mentions a Supreme Court case, the case of Camilio Weston Lara, to illustrate this point.
Right, that case involved a man who confessed to murder under hypnosis, a confession that was later deemed inadmissible by the court. It highlights the dangers of using hypnosis to extract confessions and the potential for coercion inherent in the technique.
This reminds me of those old spy movies where they use truth serums to get information out of people. Is there any truth to that?
The infamous truth serum or narcoanalysis. Meerloo acknowledges its potential uses in therapy, but cautions against overestimating its effectiveness. It's not a foolproof method for revealing the truth, and it certainly doesn't work like it does in the movies.
But even beyond the question of effectiveness, it sounds like Meerloo is deeply concerned with the ethical implications of these techniques. Digging into people's minds like that, even with the intention of finding the truth, feels like a violation somehow.
Yes, he felt very strongly that forced mental intrusion, regardless of the method used, was a violation of human dignity and freedom.
We've talked a lot about these external forces of coercion, these tactics used to manipulate people, but Meerloo also explores the internal factors that make someone vulnerable, right? What's going on inside a person that might make them more likely to break under pressure.
That's an essential part of the equation. It's not just about the tactics themselves, it's also about the individual's psychological makeup and the circumstances they're facing.
Meerloo makes this interesting comparison between the sudden surrender of individuals under interrogation and Spinoza's concept of the emotional beast within us.
Spinoza recognized that human beings aren't always rational creatures, and Meerloo applies this insight to explain why people sometimes yield to coercion, even betraying their own values. There's this primal part of us, driven by fear and the survival instinct, that can override our rational thinking, especially in high-stress situations.
So it's like our survival instinct takes over and we react in ways we wouldn't normally, even if it means compromising our morals or beliefs.
Exactly. And this isn't necessarily a sign of weakness, it's a testament to the power of our primal instincts. Meerloo also talks about something called barbed wire disease. What is that
It
exactly?
sounds intense.
The term was coined to describe the psychological effects of prolonged imprisonment. That sense of apathy, despair, and passive surrender that can set in when people are subjected to prolonged hardship, isolation, and loss of control.
I imagine that being stuck in a prison camp with no end in sight would slowly chip away at your hope and your will to resist.
It's a form of learned helplessness. Meerloo argues that this kind of experience can have lasting effects even after the person is freed, and it's not limited to literal imprisonment. It can manifest in any situation where people feel trapped and powerless.
Meerloo also mentions several other factors that contribute to this breakdown: isolation, sensory deprivation, exhaustion, fear, guilt, even conflicting loyalties.
All of these things can work together to amplify each other's effects, making resistance even more difficult. For example, isolation not only deprives you of support and validation, it also makes you more dependent on your captors, the very people who are trying to manipulate you.
It's like a vicious cycle. The more isolated you become, the more vulnerable you are to their influence. And then you add in things like sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion, both of which can impair your cognitive function and emotional stability, making it even harder to think clearly and make rational decisions. It's almost like they're intentionally breaking you down.
That's precisely the point Meerloo is making. These tactics are designed to exploit our vulnerabilities to push us to our breaking point.
So, with all this in mind, what's the takeaway for us? It's not like most of us are facing totalitarian regimes or POW camps. How does this relate to our everyday lives?
That's a great question. While most of us won't face those extreme situations, Meerloo's work isn't just about those extreme examples. It's about understanding the underlying mechanisms of mental coercion, the psychological vulnerabilities that exist in all of us, and how those vulnerabilities can be exploited even in subtle ways.
So even in our everyday interactions, we might encounter forms of manipulation that play on our fears, our insecurities, or our desire for belonging.
Exactly. Being aware of these techniques, understanding how they work, is the first step towards protecting ourselves. Meerloo's work is a call to strengthen our mental resilience, to cultivate critical thinking skills, and to be vigilant against any attempt to undermine our autonomy.
This has been a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a very complex topic.
Yes, indeed. Meerloo's work is full of insights that are as relevant today as they were when he first wrote them.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of mental coercion and menticide. Until next time.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.